On the morning of December 26, 2004, off the coast of Thailand, a group of sea nomads called the Moken were preparing their boats for a day of fishing. Then one of the elders noticed something strange. The ocean was pulling back. The waves stopped. The tide receded farther than any of them had ever seen. Fish were flopping on exposed sand, hundreds of meters from shore. The tourists on the nearby beaches walked out to look at them, laughing, taking photos. The Moken elders did not laugh. They started shouting. They grabbed their children. They ran. They ran up the hills as fast as they could, dragging anyone who would listen with them. 20 minutes later, one of the largest tsunamis in recorded history slammed into the coastline. Over 230,000 people died that day. Almost none of them were Moken. Their entire community survived because their ancestors had told them stories for generations about a wave that swallows the land. They called it the Laboon. They had never seen it. They had never experienced it. Nobody alive that morning had, but they knew what to look for. And when the ocean did the impossible, they didn't need to think. They just moved. This is not a coincidence. For most of human history, this is exactly how survival worked. For 300,000 years, your ancestors lived through floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, droughts, wildfires, and storms that would have killed every one of them if they had responded the way most modern humans do. They had no satellites, no weather apps, no seismographs, no emergency broadcasts, no warning sirens. What they had was something older, quieter, and far more effective than most of the technology we depend on today. They knew how to read the world. Let's start with the Moken, because their case is one of the best documented pieces of ancestral disaster knowledge on Earth. The Moken have lived on the Andaman Sea for at least 4,000 years. They spend so much of their lives in water that their children have developed measurably better underwater vision than the average human child. But their most remarkable adaptation isn't physical, it's memory. Every generation of Moken passes down oral stories about the sea's behavior. One of those stories describes a monstrous wave, the Laboon, that appears without warning, preceded by a sudden retreat of the ocean and the disappearance of birds and fish. The story includes exactly what to do when it happens. Get inland, get to high ground, don't stop. That story, told for centuries, saved every Moken life on their island in 2004. And they weren't alone. Off the coast of Sumatra, an island called Simeulue sat almost directly above the earthquake's epicenter. By all statistical predictions, tens of thousands of its residents should have died. Instead, 7 of them did, out of nearly 80,000 people. The reason was a single word: smog. Smog was a folk warning passed down from a tsunami that had struck the island in 1907. Grandparents had taught it to grandchildren. Grandchildren had taught it to their own kids. When the earth shook that morning and the sea began behaving strangely, entire villages ran to higher ground, without needing anyone to tell them why. They had inherited the memory. And here's where it gets stranger. In 2016, 2 researchers named Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed published a study that quietly overturned a lot of assumptions about oral history. They looked at Aboriginal Australian stories describing sea level changes, stories about ancestral lands that were now underwater, coastlines that had once been forests, islands that had once been reachable on foot. They cross-referenced the geological record. The stories matched. Many of these accounts described events that had happened between 7,000 and 13,000 years ago, during the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers raised sea levels dramatically. Which meant something remarkable. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions had accurately preserved detailed geographical memory across roughly 400 generations. No writing, no records, just stories, told carefully from parent to child for over 10,000 years. Nunn and Reed concluded that under the right cultural conditions, oral memory can outlast entire civilizations. Now consider what that means. For most of human history, disaster knowledge was not lost. It was preserved, sometimes for millennia, in the form of songs, myths, warnings, and rituals that outsiders often dismissed as superstition. The stories about angry mountains that spat fire, those were volcanic eruption warnings. The stories about giant fish that shook the earth? Those were earthquake preparation guides. The stories about the sea suddenly leaving the shore? Those were tsunami escape instructions. Every one of these stories is now being validated by modern science, and the cultures that lost them are now the ones most vulnerable to the disasters they describe. But it wasn't just stories. Your ancestors also learned to read the world in real time. They watched the behavior of animals. Dogs, elephants, birds, and fish have been documented behaving strangely before earthquakes, sometimes hours in advance. In 2004, before the tsunami hit, elephants in Sri Lanka broke their chains and ran for the hills. Flamingos abandoned their nesting grounds. Dogs refused to go outside. Ancient hunters knew this. They watched the animals not as a curiosity, but as a warning system. They watched the sky, cloud patterns, wind shifts, changes in the pressure that they could feel in their bodies before any measurable weather change occurred. They watched the ground itself. They noticed when certain plants bloomed early, when springs dried up, when water tasted different, when the smell of the air changed. Every one of these signals had meaning to a species that spent every waking hour in direct contact with the natural world. And when those signals aligned in the wrong way, our ancestors moved immediately. There's a phrase used in the emerging scientific field of traditional ecological knowledge, often called TEK. The phrase is this: your grandmother's warning was often more accurate than your smartphone alert. Because the smartphone alert only warns you when the disaster is already measurable. The ancestral warning was often the first quiet sign, the one that arrived hours or days before instruments could detect anything. Which brings us to the strangest part of this whole story. Modern civilization believes itself to be the safest human society that ever existed. We built cities, we built power grids, we built early warning systems, evacuation routes, emergency broadcasts. And in some ways, we are safer. Fewer people die from starvation. Fewer die from exposure. Fewer die from the diseases that used to wipe out entire villages in a single winter. But in other ways, we have made ourselves more fragile than any human society in history. A single week without electricity. 3 days without clean water. A single fuel disruption. A single earthquake that damages a power plant. Any of those events can now cascade into disasters that kill tens of thousands of people who would have survived them 1,000 years ago. Not because our ancestors were tougher, because they were connected to the systems that keep them alive in a way we no longer are. They knew where the water came from. They knew what the sky was doing. They knew what the animals were telling them. They knew which stories from their grandparents to trust and which ones to run from. We know the name of a president we've never met. We know the plot of a show we watched last week. We know how to unlock a phone in 1 second flat. But most of us don't know what the birds outside our windows are trying to say. We don't know what a change in the wind means. We don't know what to do if the tap stops running. We don't know the name of the river that supplies our neighborhood. We traded our ancestors' knowledge for convenience. And for most of daily life, that trade has worked. But it only holds until the day the systems fail. On that day, the knowledge that used to keep our species alive for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly becomes the only thing that matters. And most of us won't have it. So the next time you hear a story from an elder about something that used to happen here, pay attention. The next time you see animals behaving strangely, notice. The next time the sky looks wrong, or the air feels wrong, or the water tastes wrong, remember what your body has been trying to tell you. Your ancestors lived through disasters we can barely imagine. They did it by listening to the world. And every one of them who survived long enough to have children handed that ability down to you. You just have to remember how to hear it.